I am so happy to be here again with you tonight. I want to give you a little background as to how I came about doing this particular presentation. I was the archivist at the Museum of the Confederacy for 7.5 years, and trust me when I say you have no idea what I have held in my hands. I mean, it would just blow your mind what I used to hold. But one day I was in the vault, and the museum has about 40 boxes or so of correspondences of the Davis family. And so I happened to notice this one box that had servants on it. And I thought, well, what is this? So I decided to open it up, and lo and behold, there were letters from the men and women who had worked for Jefferson Davis. And it turns out that they kept in touch with both Jefferson and Marina Davis. And I thought, well, where are these letters? Why aren't they in books that have been written about Jefferson Davis? And I have no idea. I have some theories, which I will not share with you because I don't want to get sued. But I decided, well, what the heck? I'm going to go ahead and scan these letters. Now, I am sorry that I didn't scan everything that I saw there, because there were even letters from the general public of people of color that wrote letters. And it's such a different side of the Davis family that you do not hear about. So I decided I am going to put together a presentation and share these letters with people. So that's what I'm going to do tonight. I actually have 2 presentations, but I don't know how long I'm able to talk with y'all tonight. So of the 2, I really wanted you to hear this one, because people are...
You can talk as long as you want, but we're going home at 8 o'clock.
Okay. All right. That's good to know. So I'm going to start my presentation. And I started with, it's truly an honor to be with you today. We are in the midst of a great crisis in this country. The acceleration of the removal of symbols and monuments to Confederate history is now rampant. Students at a university voted to have a statue of Jefferson Davis removed because they said he is racist. Others wanted to remove sections of the Davis Highway and rename it because he is a bigot. It is unbelievable. What if the history of Jefferson Davis disappeared? However, are these people willing to change other aspects of history that involve Davis' legacy? Let's take the U.S. Army. Davis has strengthened it and increased the salary of the military when he was Secretary of War. And ironically, this is the U.S. military that when he becomes president of the CSA, that he is going to have to work against. The U.S. Capitol building in D.C. would have to lose its wings because of his involvement with that. The aqueduct in Washington, D.C., which is in Georgetown, would have to disappear. The railroad expansion to the Pacific would not exist. Scientific advances in weaponry would have lagged. He actually was friends with Samuel Colt. The improvements in West Point's curriculum would have languished. Jefferson Davis is our history. He is part and parcel of our collective past. I was blessed to be the archivist at the former Museum of the Confederacy for 7.5 years, and in its collections are documents that prove that he had an extraordinary relationship with people of color. However, to understand Jefferson Davis, we must examine his older brother, Joseph Davis. Joseph Davis was Jefferson Davis' mentor after the death of their father. He was an important figure and followed most of his advice from him. Joseph, a lawyer, was the owner of Hurricane, a huge plantation. His plantation thrived due to his treatment of slaves. The men and women of color lived in 2-room cabins with porches in the front and the back. There was no rationing of food, and he dressed them well. If there was any infractions, there were hearings held every Sunday where the slave was judged and sentenced by his or her peers. If the punishment was too harsh, Joseph would step in to lessen the sentence. The men and women of color were encouraged to study and expand their skills. He encouraged entrepreneurship. He allowed the celebrations of birthdays, weddings, and other joyous events. One of the most fascinating stories is about one of his slaves named Benjamin Montgomery. Joseph bought Benjamin, who was born in Virginia, and brought him to Hurricane. Montgomery ran away, but Joseph sent for word for him to return. It turned out that homesickness was the issue, but Joseph realized his intelligence and offered the use of the library to Benjamin. Montgomery's skills will lead him to become the manager of the plantation and to become an entrepreneur with Joseph's blessing. When Benjamin took a wife, she was free to run her household and raise the children due to the money he earned. He paid Joseph in cash for her not to have to work on the plantation. Jefferson Davis admired the operation of Hurricane and spent many hours learning from his brother. He would apply the same procedure at his plantation, Briarfield, named because there were so many briars. Davis had a close relationship with a slave from his youth named James Pemberton. He had traveled with Davis when he was in the military service and was with Davis during bouts of malaria. The bond was so strong that Pemberton would become the overseer of Briar. There was mutual respect and they even smoked cigars together. Pemberton ran the plantation until his death in 1852. Jefferson Davis felt that he should not name his slaves, and they were able to choose their own names. There were no nicknames on his plantation. Just like Joseph, he set up a court system where the slaves served on the jury. These servants had land to grow vegetables and had chickens for eggs and pigs for meat. What they didn't eat, they could sell, and they kept the funds. Dentists and doctors would call in to take care of his workers, and they were well clothed. Davis also had a white Methodist minister to come to both Hurricane and Briarfield because it was important for the servants to know Christianity. A man of color who could no longer work kept up the spirituality of the workers on the plantation. Uncle Bob was given a house as well as a horse and buggy to travel around the plantation. When Jefferson Davis became president of the Confederate States of America, he left the running of his plantation to his slaves. He gave them all the supplies and extra blankets that he could afford. When the federal troops arrived at Briarfield, they did not believe that Davis had left them to run the plantation and took their supplies. They even confiscated the blankets. Some of the men and women of color were moved off the plantation and taken into Vicksburg. When Sherman's army captured them, they refused to follow the troops. This caused great consternation, so the army burned their houses to make them leave. Others were left on the plantation only to have General Grant add recently freed men and women of color at Briarfield. The plantation was now overcrowded, and Davis's slaves, including Uncle Bob, was pushed off the land. At the White House of the Confederacy, the household consisted of immigrants, slaves, and free people of color. In 1862, Jefferson Davis was concerned that the war was getting too close to Richmond. Davis sent his wife, Roane, and the children to North Carolina. There, Mrs. Davis met a free Indian Negro, and this is how he described himself, whom she hired. When she returned to Richmond, she brought James Henry Jones to be Mr. Davis' coachman and valet. They worked well together. When the Davis family left Richmond in 1865, Jones went with him and was captured with the entourage. He would spend a short time with Davis at Fortress Monroe. He returned to North Carolina and became a prominent citizen. Mr. Jones never forgot Jefferson Davis. When Davis' funeral cortege arrived in North Carolina, James drove the hearse. At the same time, Mrs. Davis, with great fanfare, gave a beautiful cane to him. This cane had an inscription on the silver band that said, "To my friend James Jones from Marina Davis." Why is this so important? It was known in Southern society at that time a man of color was not given the status attached to owning a cane. To own a cane meant that one held a high position in society. Mrs. Davis defied rules of society by giving Jones the cane. The cane is now the property of the North Carolina Museum of History. And ladies and gentlemen, I have actually seen the cane and held it in my very own hands. His relationship with the Davis family did not end with Jefferson Davis' funeral. He would drive the funeral carriage for Davis' daughter Winnie in 1898 and for Verena Davis in 1906. Mr. Jones will make the trip back to Richmond, Virginia to see the laying of the cornerstone of the Jefferson Davis Monument. James Jones continued to let the newspapers know of his fondness for the president. He was a staunch defender of Jefferson Davis, especially if someone wrote that Jefferson Davis was in a dress when he was captured. He always corrected the story in the press. So please bear with me as I continue to give you some more stories about the relationship between the Davis family and people of color. Many of you may know the story of the little boy named Jim Limber. I was not able to locate primary documents, but according to the secondary sources, Jim, who was 5 or 6 at the time, was rescued from an abusive relative by Verena Davis. One source actually mentioned a different name than the name that we are familiar with today. According to an article in the Swanee Review by Arthur Fleming, he wrote that the boy's name was James Henry Brooks. Jefferson Davis took the boy to the mayor of Richmond's office to register him as a free Negro. Limber moved in to live with the Davis family at the White House of the Confederacy and was a playmate for the children. He even belonged to the same gang as the Davis boys, known as the Hill Cats. Limber was injured, and President Davis decided to persuade a truce between the Hill Cats and the Butcher Cats. However, he was not successful. When the Davis family evacuated from the White House in 1865, Jim went with them. When Verena and her family were captured, the Federal Army took Limber away from them. Mrs. Davis strongly protested, but to no avail. According to the author, he was sent to South Carolina and then to New England, where he went to school with other Sea Island black children. He would get into fights when he defended the Davises. Many years after the war, a young man claimed that he was Limber and that he was abused by the Davis family. However, Mrs. Davis fervently denied this claim. It is interesting that 2 books written about Jefferson Davis did not mention Jim Limber. Who really knows what happened to him? Robert Brown came with Jefferson Davis from Briarfield. He was very devoted to the Davis family and was known as Iron Man. He was with Mrs. Davis when she was captured. According to Fleming, on the boat that brought Verena to Savannah, a sailor taunted her and it irritated Brown. Robert Brown asked, "Am I your equal?" "Yes, certainly," was the sailor's reply. Brown said, "Then take this," and he knocked the sailor to the ground. While Verena was detained in Savannah, Robert Brown took the children to relatives in Canada and took care of the children. He will eventually go into service for Jefferson Davis when he was released from Fortress Monroe. When Mr. Davis died, he moved to Colorado to work for Margaret Hayes Davis, the oldest daughter. He lived with the family until his death at the age of 100. Another man in service spent some time with Jefferson Davis at Fortress Monroe. He wrote a letter to Verena Davis to inform her of the condition of her husband. Fortress Monroe, July 18, 1865. Dear Madam, I am living at this place with my wife, Ellen. I write a few lines to inform you that he whom you most desire to hear of is well and in good spirits. Ellen and myself are both well. I wish if I can raise money enough to go on and pay you a visit. Ellen sends her love to you and the children and desires to know how you all are, particularly Willie and the baby. Mary Ann also sends her love to Maggie. This letter will be mailed here in consequence of my being here today, but you will direct your answer to Fortress Monroe. Yours very truly, Charles Barnes. P.S. Let me know to whom to direct your letters. The Davis family was very close to Ellen and Frederick McGinnis. Ellen had been the nanny, which was an amazing feat. Mr. Davis did not believe in disciplining the children, and many nannies did not survive in their position. Ellen also spent some time in Fortress Monroe. She and her husband, Frederick, was settled in Baltimore and continued to write letters to Verena. Earlier, I had mentioned that Verena Davis had presented a cane to James Henry Jones. She also sent one to Frederick McGinnis. He wrote that the cane arrived safely and he was going to let the Society of Confederate Army and Navy borrow it. How remarkable that this information has been dormant for so many years. In the former Museum of the Confederacy, there are additional letters from ex-servants and other people of color who admired and kept in touch with the Davis family. One of the most amazing documents written to Mrs. Verena Davis is the letter of condolence after the death of Jefferson Davis. Please permit me to read this letter to you. Briarfield, Mississippi, December 12, 1889. To Mrs. Jefferson Davis, Beauvoir, Mississippi. We, the old servants and tenants of our beloved master, Honorable Jefferson Davis, have cause to mingle our tears over his death, who was always so kind and thoughtful for our peace and happiness. We express our humble sympathy. Respectfully yours, old tenants and servants, Tel D. Everson, Ned Gator, Hy Garland, Tom McKinney, Louisa Neck, Grant McKinney, William Green, Mary Pemberton, Gus Williams, Mary Archer, Elizabeth Martin, William Norris, Israel Ketchens, and others. According to the book, the Davis Memorial Volume, or Our Dear President Jefferson Davis and the World's Tribute to His Memory, and I quote, "Another of his old servants came all the way from Florida to see him when he learned of his sickness and deeply distressed at his death. And one of the most touching incidents of the funeral was the presence and sorrow of some of his old servants. If you recall, I had mentioned Benjamin Montgomery and his relationship with Joseph Davis. Mr. Montgomery's son Isaiah was also an entrepreneur. In 1886, 3 years before the death of Jefferson Davis, he wrote this letter. I forgot to show you the condolence letter, sorry. The Colored State Fair Association, second annual meeting at Vicksburg, Mississippi, November 10th through the 13th, 1886. Isaiah T. Montgomery, President. Vicksburg, Mississippi, September 27th, 1886. Honorable Jefferson Davis, Beauvoir, Harrison County, Mississippi. Dear Sir, feeling assured that you would take active interest in any enterprise tending to the welfare and development of the colored people of Mississippi, we have today mailed you a catalog of the first fair held in '85 and some notices of the second meeting, which takes place at the fairground near the city from the 10th to the 13th November next. If convenient for you to be in this locality about that time, we would be highly pleased to have you visit the fair. We would also esteem it a special mark of encouragement if yourself and distinguished lady would name a special premium, see pages 12 to 14 in the catalog, in any line that may suit you, to be put in our catalog for '86 and completed for this at the coming fair, with best wishes for your continuous preservation. I am respectfully your obedient servant, Isaiah Montgomery, President. Recently, I came upon an article in an old issue of the Confederate Veteran magazine about an ex-slave who knew Jefferson Davis when he was a politician in Washington. He saw him at the Prentice House in Vicksburg in 1872 conversing with several men. He approached Davis and said, "Morris Jeff, don't you know me?" Starting to his feet quickly, Mr. Davis advanced, extending his hand, which the man grasped as he bowed. "Why, Lewis, I am truly glad to see you," said Mr. Davis with evident emotion. Hope you're well. Yes, Lewis, my health is very good. Turning to the gentleman who had witnessed the scene with interest, Mr. Davis said, "Gentlemen, please excuse me. I wish to have a few minutes conversation with this man," and led the way to the writing room. The clerk turned the key in the lock to prevent interruption. After half an hour, they came out, traces of tears on their faces. Mr. Davis passed at once to his room, and the old man of color, hat in hand, and went out the door. He made the comment that Mr. Davis was the same man as was before the war. I can provide more letters from people of color who wrote to Jefferson and Marina Davis. However, in the interest of time, I will conclude my speech. It is so frustrating, or actually quite maddening, reading or hearing people call Jefferson Davis a racist or a bigot. Books written about him do not spend much time on his relationship with people of color, although these letters are in archives and boxes sitting on shelves. So if you ever get a chance to see some of these letters, which I will tell you now are at the Virginia Historical Society, now known as the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, you can have a chance to actually examine these letters yourself. So that is the end of my presentation dealing with the Davis family and their relationship with people of color. Now, it's not quite 8 o'clock. Do you want me to talk about Jefferson Davis as an American? And this is my talk dealing with him before he becomes President of the Confederate States of America. Now, I'm going to give you the background of how I ended up doing this particular presentation, because this one is hilarious what happened. So I was asked by the UDC for their special program called Mastering the Flags to do something about Jefferson Davis. And so the first year, I did the one I just finished. And then I was told, I want you. Now, I wasn't saying, Teresa, just do something about Jefferson Davis. I was told, I would like for you to do a presentation that says, Jefferson Davis, American. Now, I want you to know, I looked at her and I said, no problem. I can do that. Yeah. What was I thinking? I can tell you right now, I thought, how hard can it be? And so I stood in front of my bookshelf, and trust me, my personal bookshelf is unbelievable with the history books I have. So I'm standing there, and first of all, I went, oh my gosh, I had no idea I had so many books dealing with Jefferson Davis. That was shocking in itself. So I said, well, I'll be able to put this together. So I spread the books out, opened them up, started taking notes. I'm just writing, and writing. And then one day, I had a slight temper tantrum, slammed all the books shut, threw my notes across the room, and Eric said to me, he says, what is the problem, Teresa? I said, I can't write this. He says, well, why can't you write it? I said, because there's so much to talk about, and I cannot figure out what to do. And he says, well, Teresa, just put the books away, put your notes away, and just chill out for a week and then come back to it. I said, I have to give this talk in 2 weeks. And he says, oh, well, I took his advice and I closed all the books and I took the time out to calm down and I said, okay, woosah, I can do this. And so this is what I came up with as my speech, Jefferson Davis, American. So it says, you would think it would be easy to talk about Jefferson Davis, American. However, it is not easy. Why, you may ask? Because there's so much about him that is so interesting, and for some authors, it took multi-volumes to write his history. When I give tours in the UDC Memorial Building, I would stop in the foyer and stand before a life-size portrait of Davis, and most people can tell me that he was the President of the Confederate States of America. When I ask them, what else do you know about him? Their faces go blank. So let's begin with the basics. Jefferson Davis was born on June 3rd in Kentucky. And if you drive through Kentucky, it will say, welcome to Kentucky, the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln. You will not find a sign that says, "Welcome to Kentucky, the birthplace of Jefferson Davis." I just thought I'd put that out there for you. Depending on the resources, one reads that it was 1807, and then other says 1808. There is some confusion about the year. However, it's been accepted that it's 1808. He was the 10th and final child of Sam and Jane Davis. He graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point, number 23 out of 33, which is a feat since he was court-martialed twice. After a brief stint in the military, Davis became a cotton planter. He married Sarah Knox Taylor, the daughter of Zachary Taylor, in 1835 and lost her 3 months later to malaria. This caused him to go into a 7-year seclusion. After his extended grieving period, he married Verena Banks Howard in 1845. He will become the father of 6 children with her. Now you may ask, how is he an American? Jefferson Davis entered the world of politics unexpectedly in 1843. He and his brother Joseph, who was his mentor, attended the Mississippi State Convention. Davis impressed several men at the conference. However, someone else was nominated at that meeting. Then the candidate running in Warren County withdrew on October 30th. John B. Williamson's withdrawal became Davis' opportunity. He wrote a letter to the press endorsing Jefferson Davis for the House of Representatives. It was just not his time. Davis was defeated. In July of 1845, Davis was nominated as representative at the state convention. The campaign was tough, but he won the seat. Davis immediately became involved in the duties before him. He also had to deal with requests from people who wanted favors. There were issues with manifest destiny, the expansion of states within the continent. There were fights about Texas, Oregon, and Mexico. His concerns were mostly about Oregon and Mexico. Some of his colleagues wanted to go into war with the British to acquire Oregon. In his speech to Congress, he said, and I quote, "Unfortunately, the opinion has gone forth that no politician dares to be the advocate of peace when the question of war is mooted. There will be an evil hour, the sands of our republic will be nearly run, when it shall be the power of the demagogue or fanatic to raise a war clamor and control the legislation of the country. The evils of war must fall upon the people, and with them the war feeling should originate. We, their representatives, are but a mirror to reflect the light and never should become a torch to fire the pile. But sir, though gentlemen go, torch in hand, among combustible materials, they will declare there is no danger of fire. War speeches and measures threatening war are mingled with profuse assurance of peace. Sir, we cannot expect, we should not require our adversaries to submit to more than we would bear, and I ask, after the notice has been given and the 12 months have expired, who would allow Great Britain to exercise exclusive jurisdiction over Oregon? If we would resist such an act by force of arms before ourselves performing it, we should prepare for war," end quote. According to Verena's biography about her husband, he felt that if there was going to be war, one needed to have military roads, forts, and to befriend the Indians in the area. Once all of this was established, then the nation could fight the British. Luckily, it did not happen. His speech that day impressed John Quincy Adams. Yes, you heard correctly. I said John Quincy Adams, who served in Congress after his presidency. He congratulated Davis for his speech and shook his hand. He said to others, quote, "We shall hear more from this young man. That gentleman is no ordinary man. He will make his mark, yet mind me," end quote. His next project was to sit on the committee to assist in getting a bill passed to create the Smithsonian Institute. James Smithson had left a bequest of $508,000 to the United States. After several defeats and amendments, legislation to establish the Smithsonian finally passed through Congress. At the same time, the long simmering conflict with Mexico erupted. War breaks out, and Davis felt that he needed to take a more active role. It was his patriotic duty. He wrote in the Vicksburg Sentinel, quote, "My education and former practice would think enable me to be of service to the Mississippians who take the field. If they wish it, I will join them as soon as possible, wherever they may be," end quote. He resigned and will serve under his former father-in-law, Zachary Taylor. Davis insisted that his regiment be outfitted with rifles, and they were known as the Mississippi Rifles. How did Colonel Davis become the hero of Buena Vista? Quote, "He ordered a tremendous volley that felled Mexicans like a scythe. Joined by the 3rd Indiana, Davis' command chased the enemy infantry down the ridge and through a nearby ravine. Taken under fire by troops from 3 of the Mexican division, Jefferson Davis saw the enemy lancers passing on his left and directed his troops to retire to their original positions. Painfully wounded in the right foot by a bullet, which lodged a bit of brass from a spur deep in his flesh, Davis refused to leave the field," end quote. This wound will bother him for the rest of his life. He will also use crutches for 2 years. It is during this war that he is known for the famous quote, "Stand fast." President Polk offered Davis the rank of Brigadier General. He weighed his options and finally turned down the position. Politics was calling him again. On August 10, 1847, Davis was appointed Senator of Mississippi due to the death of Jesse Speight. He assumed his seat in the Senate on December 6. On December 30, 1847, Jefferson Davis was appointed a regent of the Smithsonian. With that duty, he became the chairman of the building committee, which meant creating improvements to the mall. He was intimately involved with the construction of the buildings. He made speeches that involved a variety of issues, such as a bill to increase the Army, temporary occupation of the Yucatan by the United States, territorial government for Oregon, slavery, and the establishment of the Department of the Interior. In December of 1849, Davis was made chairman of the Senate Committee on Military Affairs. In February 1850, Jefferson Davis was elected to the Senate for another 6-year term. But does he stay in political position? No is the answer. He made the decision to run for governor and met defeat in November of 1851. However, his political career was not over. He became Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce on March 7, 1853. What was the first task that he tackled? It was the United States Army, and here are some of his recommendations. Number 1, he urged that armament for the most important points in Texas and the Pacific Coast be strengthened and improved. Number 2, he recommended an increase of the existing pay, an additional increase for each successive period of 5 years, so long as the soldiers shall remain in the Army, and provisions of the promotion to the lower grade of commissioned officers for such of the non-commissioned officers of the Army as might be found qualified for, and by their conduct, character, and services entitled to such advancements. Number 3, Davis urgently recommended that there should be added to the existing military establishment 2 regiments of riflemen and 1 regiment dragoons with an additional company sappers and miners. Number 4, he advocated for the extension of the pension system to the widows and orphans of officers and soldiers of the regular Army, the creation of a retired list for disabled and superannuated officers, the increase of the pay of officers, which no longer bore the same relations to the value of money that it bore when the compensation was fixed, for the increased comfort of troops in the barracks, and for the distribution of the United States arms to several states according to congressional representation instead of in proportion to the number of militia in each. And number 5, he recommended the increase of the academic term at the military academy at West Point to a 5-year term. Although his recommendations were not totally implemented, over time his forward-thinking ideas strengthened the American Army, an army he will eventually have to fight against as the President of the Confederate States of America. Other tasks before him as Secretary of War was the supervision of the expansion of the United States Capitol. The expansion was needed because of the growth of both the Senate and House chambers. His department also had the task of figuring out how to bring adequate supply of water into the District of Columbia. The supply came from the Great Falls of the Potomac. Quote, when finished, it was found capable of delivering nearly 70 million gallons of water at an elevation of 14 feet above the upper floors of the Capitol, end quote. What were some of the other successes that Davis accomplished during his period as Secretary of War? Quote, he gave such valuable suggestions to workmen at Colt's Armory that they made him a special pistol on the civil breech of which they engraved the words, to a brother inventor, end quote. In case you're wondering, this was Samuel Colt's business. It used to be, and I don't know if it still is, if you go to the White House of the Confederacy and get a tour, when you look in Jefferson Davis' office, you will see that weapon there on the desk. I don't know if it's still there, but it used to be. Quote, Davis had numberless forts repaired and rehabilitated, notably the one in Portland Harbor, for which at one time it seemed impossible to construct a solid foundation. In the evenings at home, he personally translated a book on the service of camels from the French and succeeded in getting them brought out for the uses of Army transportation across the arid prairies, in other words, Southwest Desert. And if the experiment had been properly and persistently pushed to its legitimate results, we should now have the prairies covered with these ships of the desert and the facilities for the transportation of armies much increased, end quote. A northern newspaper had this to say about Jefferson Davis, quote, he revised the Army regulations. He introduced light infantry or the rifle systems of tactics. He caused the manufacturing of rifles, muskets, and pistols, and the use of the mini-ball. He induced the addition of 4 regiments to the Army and organized a cavalry service peculiarly adapted to the wants of the country. He augmented the seacoast and frontier defenses of the country and had the western part of the continent explored for scientific, geographical, and railroad purposes, end quote. On March 4, 1857, he had an appointment with President Pierce. In the office, Davis tendered his resignation. The president said, quote, I can scarcely bear the parting from you, who have been strength and solace to me for 4 anxious years and never failed me, end quote. What was in store for Jefferson Davis? He made the decision to run for Senate. He won and was sworn in for a 6-year term in 1857. He was served in this role until Mississippi seceded on January 9, 1861. Davis delivered a farewell address in the Senate chamber and withdrew from the Senate on January 21, 1861. Now, the reason why this is so important that you know this information, because most people have no idea that Jefferson Davis was important to American history. Most people know that he was the President of the Confederate States of America, and that is it, period. His memorial that was on Monument Avenue explained his importance to American and Confederate history. Unfortunately, ignorance and hatred caused it to be removed. Jefferson Davis was an American. He died without obtaining his U.S. citizenship. However, in the Caroline Meriwether Goodlet Library, there is an artifact. It is a precious artifact. A special pen lies in a case. On October 17, 1978, President Jimmy Carter officially restored full citizenship rights of Jefferson Davis by using that pen. So the next time you visit the Smithsonian, look at the aqueduct in Georgetown, or visit the U.S. Capitol, please remember the influences of Jefferson Davis. Thank you.